morning. No, it's actually past morning now. Thank you all for coming. We have a great panel for you this afternoon. I'd like to start by just giving a brief introduction to our fantastic panel here. You'll see there's been a change to the original agenda. Dr. Peter Euban couldn't make it today, but we have a fantastic replacement. Kim Wilson is here joining us from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She's also a fellow at the Center for Emerging Market Enterprises and at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts. And she brings a wealth of experience to the table, so we're excited to have her here moderating. On the panel, we have Dr. Laura Roper. Roper is a widely published scholar whose breadth of knowledge with NGOs includes more than 15 years of work with Oxfam America. And she's most recently worked as a nonprofit management consultant for the past 7 years and worked with a variety of NGOs in that position. Beside her, we have Simone Dietrich, who's a postdoctoral research associate at the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance at Princeton, and she's currently working on her PhD. And finally, we have Ashley Tungus, who brings 12 years of experience in global development to the table. She's worked extensively with Oxfam America and is currently teaching at the Fletcher School. So please help me welcome them to Harvard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Welcome, everybody. It's a beautiful day here. And we are going to set up our panel so that it's more of a conversation. So I'm going to start off and ask 3 very direct questions to each of the panelists. And as they start to hear each other and you start to hear them, we'd like to have a conversation. My hunch is there's a mix in this group. Some of you might be academics and others practitioners. Some of you might be a blend. We're lucky enough today to have people that represent all facets of that. So think about the kind of questions you'd like to ask. So I'm going to just jump straight away into questions that they've been thinking about. So the first one is, do you agree that there is more than myopic self-interest that drives aid? And is there any evidence of that? So I think I'm going to start off with Ashley at the end here.
So I have to say, I laughed every time I read that question. I reread it, and I would say I laughed at least 4 times before I got used to the question, because I think it is the perfect, it's a perfect question that we ask ourselves a lot in the developing community, and it's sort of, I think of it as equal parts self-loathing and self-adoration, because in my mind, as much as anything, the development community is made up of humans who all struggle with myopic self-interest, just like any other human being. And so the question is, as a collection of individuals, as a collection of human beings, how do we do more and more of what is going to lead to great impact, which is going to lead to changes in well-being and power, and do less of what is not as effective? But it's not about becoming better human beings, it's about embracing our human nature and really trying to channel, at the end of the day, what many of us find satisfaction in, which is trying to make a difference, and to put some parameters around that and put some criteria around that that allows us to move forward. So I think it's less trying to escape our human roots and really trying to embrace them and develop a development practice that allows us to move forward.
Sorry, Ashley, would you like to give us an example of that? Maybe where something concrete, where you and your team members actually struggled with some of these issues, the self-interest versus the mission?
Yeah. So as an example, and I'll go into this a little bit more later, but often as an organization, what you're looking for is, and actually as individual practitioners, what you're looking for is to prove that you did something well and that you had an impact. And I think more and more when we're thinking about a systems approach, when we're thinking about working in coalition, when we're thinking about long-term change, you have to be willing to step away from that a bit and say, we are contributing to an overall change, but we can't always say, I did this, and I'm going to hold this up and say we were the only ones who ever thought of this. You're thinking much more about how my small contribution to this is going to move a much longer process in a much more complex environment. And that can be difficult for development practitioners to take away that the pat you get on the back, and actually the satisfaction that you get in being able to recognize your own very concrete contribution.
Great, thank you. Simone, I think you have a different perspective. You're looking at aid from the inside out, but also at allocation. So not just where the rubber meets the road, but how these kinds of things are funded. Maybe you could give your perspective.
Yeah, so there is a very big literature in economics and political science that basically argues that donors are really not responsive to corruption. And that means that donors don't really care about aid effectiveness because they continue to channel aid to countries that are poorly governed. And from our previous panel, I don't know how many of you stayed in the room, but it was very clear that there are certain societies where donors should actually anticipate governments to pocket the aid and not allocate it effectively. And so the scholars like Bill Easterly and Dambisa de Moyo have contributed to this very strong aid skepticism, and that's particularly among the development community, but also among academics. And while skepticism is always important, some of their assumptions that they're making are just oversimplified. And I'm going to give you an example of that. When you, for instance, think about two very different countries in terms of corruption, developing countries in terms of how they place on the corruption index, we have Haiti on the one hand, which receives roughly $70 in 2009 in per capita aid from OECD donor countries. And on the other hand, you find Tanzania, which receives slightly less, but has better state institutions, right? And so if one were to just merely think of aid flows as government-to-government transfers, then we would be slightly perplexed and wonder, what is going to happen to the aid that goes to Haiti, right? But then, if we move away from this oversimplification that all aid is simply a cash handout to the recipient government, then we see that donors, in fact, have tools that allow them to address governance and corruption issues more or less successfully, of course, in the recipient country. And in Tanzania, for instance, 15% of the aid goes around the government. That is, it gets channeled through NGOs, it gets channeled through IOs or private contracting firms. In Haiti, on the other hand, more than 60% of the aid bypasses the recipient government, which means that on average, donors seem to be very selective in the tools that they choose to work with the recipient government, and also to try and ensure that the end user actually receives the aid. And that, just by thinking a little bit more about this heterogeneity of aid and the different types of tools, we're quickly starting to see that oversimplifications really don't lead us towards a very productive road in terms of engaging on the future in development cooperation. And so I think of my research as sort of focusing on one aspect of it, and that is this question of who receives the aid and trying to understand the constraints and incentives of these different implementing agents, and thinking about accountability relationships down the road that is much more sort of engaging with the real world of development practice. And so in some sense, while some people might argue there's a lot of donor governments are particularly interested in policy concessions or pursuing their geostrategic goals, there seems to be real evidence that donors, in fact, do not just pursue policy concessions, because if the money does not go through the government channel, then they're not able to buy policy for their goals. And so just to quickly round up, and generally I think people often tend to think of this dichotomy between self-interest and altruism. And I don't necessarily think that is very helpful. In fact, especially in the post-September, since in the 2000s, I would argue, a lot of, like, development not just has this altruistic motive. In fact, it is very much geared towards security, right? So development is good for national security. The U.S. administration has articulated in like the 3D framework, and so it's. I think on the one hand, it's okay. It's important to ask that question, but I think one should emphasize the extent to which not necessarily the donor is motivated to do good, but the extent to which they're able to push development in the recipient country.
So I'm going to move on, but there's two thoughts that are sort of boiling in my mind here. One is a question about stripping governance and issues around sustainability, and we'll get to that in a moment. And the second is development really good for security? And I'm sure all of you can think of examples in your mind where maybe we want to see a little bit more evidence about that. So those are two questions coming up. Laura Roper, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, in this tradition,
myopic self-interest, is that what drives aid? And if so, or if not, where's the evidence?
well, in the tradition of good academics everywhere, I'm going to answer the question I wish I'd been asked instead of the one I was asked. And the question made me think about different kinds of myopia. I think actually that, in a way, is a bigger problem than self-interest that is too instrumental in its approach to development. And I've been in the development sector for many, many years, and through those years you see different fads kicking in. And there's an expression that if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And so during the 1980s and 1990s, structural adjustment was a big hammer that was embraced by the IMF and World Bank, and it was applied across the board in kind of a cookie-cutter way. It probably helped in some contexts, but it was very, very damaging in other contexts. Likewise, a lot of international agencies and international NGOs have embraced this notion of rights-based development that has many, many merits and, of course, resonates particularly among Americans and Western Europeans, given our historical and political background. But you see, as a rights-based approach is pushed in some contexts, that there's backlash. So one of the changes that you saw, particularly in the 2000s, was more and more governments heavily regulating the NGO sector in their countries and really reducing more and more of the policy space, the advocacy that those organizations can do. And so there's always this dynamic of a thrust in a new direction, and then a kind of reaction. It's in a sense, a kind of dialectic. So I really find it very important and interesting to really unpack people's assumptions around the development initiatives and interventions they're doing. And it's very important to test those assumptions early on, as opposed to getting surprises later on. A key example from my experience with Oxfam was in 2002, 2001, Oxfam launched a big Make Trade Fair campaign that was targeted at the WTO. And they were quite effective in reaching policymakers in the WTO and mobilizing at the national level. But when the European and US governments realized they weren't going to get what they wanted through the WTO process, they moved to more bilateral trade agreements where the disparities in power between the US or the European Union and Mali or Colombia or whatever were so enormous that they ran through much worse, from the southern government country perspective, much worse trade deals than they might have agreed to within the WTO. So that's the kind of lenses and distortions, I guess, that really interest me.
So a lot of your work is about the learning organization, and so how when you're unpacking these kinds of things, as you mentioned, these different points of view, how do you bring that together concretely so that there's institutional learning versus just a lot of individuals brainstorming and saying this worked, that didn't work?
I mean, that is very, very hard to do. I mean, that's the short answer. I think an organization has to make a very intentional decision to be much more mindful and testing themselves and challenging themselves much more rigorously. This whole movement in monitoring, evaluation, and learning to define your theory of change, I think, has been really important. I think it's a very mixed bag in terms of the quality of theories of change and how people understand it and whatnot. But really to have that discussion early on and have someone there facilitating, saying, you know, why do you think this, and what would be an alternative scenario if your assumptions are wrong, is very, very important. I do think donors are demanding more accountability from international agencies. There's the difficulty that donors actually often aren't very sophisticated about the nature of development and its complexity. So there's a tension there, but I think it actually is quite helpful that there's some of that pressure from the outside.
I'm going to digress from our questions for a moment and ask, we have two representatives from Oxfam. So a lot of you are familiar with, there's different kinds of aid. Some aid is humanitarian aid, and it is what it sounds like. Other kinds of aid are aid that passes through governments, program aid. Then there's project aid. And amidst all this, there's also two very different approaches to aid. So one is a service-based approach. You have a need, or there's a market, and a service is going to go through certain channels. Then there's a rights-based approach, which is a little bit different. So maybe Ashley and perhaps then Laura, what would be nice is maybe to tell the group, what is the theory of change in a rights-based approach? You mentioned that word. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page, because it's a little bit different, I think, than in a service-based approach.
Anyone else need to find it?
So the thinking behind a rights-based approach is that in order to have sustained and meaningful change, what you are seeking is not only a change in well-being, which you may be able to get through a service project, but you're also seeking ultimately a shift in power for the communities that you are working with, that they are able to access those services or other goods or services that they need through being able to claim their rights. And we would say at Oxfam, and that actually is about power shifts. It's not only about making sure, Oxfam doesn't go and make sure this government then fills that right. It's the community itself needs to have the power to be able to claim those rights. So it changes the way that you think about what your program is going to look like, and oftentimes it also implicitly means you're engaging a system. So you're not only looking at a small piece of what's happening at a community level, for example, but you're thinking about, well, if there's an issue around water, then why is that in place, and why has that situation been there for so long, and what does that tell us about a rights denial, and who is the duty bearer, and from there you start to build your theory of change. So in general, your theory of change is very much based off of, this is the issue that we want to impact, and we're trying to build out from there what that means about the broader systems and implications.
So in that example of water, what might be an outcome that you're looking for if you're using a rights-based approach?
To use an example, there's a program in Ethiopia that for a very long time was actually basically a service delivery project. It was building small-scale irrigation systems in various communities in Ethiopia. And now what they're trying to move to is, how do you help that community be able to claim from the government more investment in small-scale irrigation systems, so that and also to start to influence other donors and say, how are you going to be able to support these kind of systems that we are seeing work in these cases and not in these cases? So it's working with the community and also bringing together sometimes unusual actors and coalitions. So you're bringing the government into the conversation very early on. You're bringing in potentially large-scale donors into the conversation very early on, and you're putting them in a conversation with community members who are directly impacted. Now there's work by John Gaventa that would say the kind of space you create for those kind of conversations matters. It's not only about, there's the magic that happens when you bring a community member from Yabella into a room with a government official and boom, magic and all the power shifted, that there's a very intentional process that happens over a long period of time to create the kind of power needed for sustainable change.
Sorry, just let's ignore that. So, Laura, I guess what I'd ask from you is how do you learn in that kind of a context? I mean, I can see where learning is pretty easy. If you're building bridges, then, okay, there's a crack in the bridge, let's not do that next time. Let's get the engineers out here. How do you learn when in a rights-based approach?
Well, I guess a useful frame for that is this literature that's developing on developmental evaluation. They argue that a lot of the really interesting and challenging development work is basically unpredictable. It's multi-actor, it's non-linear. They even say, maybe when you're starting out, you don't have a theory of change because you don't know enough. And so they structure basically a very, an ongoing process with very tight feedback loops. So you're constantly kind of checking in with each other and rejiggering your strategy. An example that I saw of this, although they didn't call it that, but they were in fact doing it, was a gender-based violence prevention program in El Salvador that's been going on for about 10 years now. Oxfam America was the original convener, the Dutch government was an original funder, and they ended up working with five or six women's organizations in El Salvador. El Salvador is an extremely difficult context for many, many, many reasons. And in this strategy, Oxfam decided that it was going to try and work with the Arena government, the very conservative right-wing government, to bring about change, because there have been years and years of protests and street demonstrations and awareness raising, and still there's been no law passed on gender-based violence. And this was quite controversial within the women's movement to be working with Arena, which was really a very hideously right-wing party. And just a great deal of skepticism that Oxfam and its partners could make any headway. And so they had a core steering committee. They had biannual meetings that went on for several days where they considered strategy and examined how it was going in different departments that they were working in. They had multiple points of entry, so they were getting in through the Ministry of Education, the justice system, the police department. They were really doing a lot of different stuff because they didn't know sort of where those leverage points were and where they'd get traction. The women on the steering committee literally talked almost every day. So they had a very tight feedback loop, and they also had this attitude that we're going to try something, and if it doesn't work, we're going to cut our losses and we're going to move on to something else. So it was very much an attitudinal aspect to it too. And that's one of the best examples I've seen of that, and it's not rocket science. I mean, it's just, you have to decide to do it, you have to get the right people, you have to be very intentional at looking at the evidence and what's happening around you, and then you have to be willing to change.
Actually, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to follow up, and one of the interesting, and Laura actually did a great evaluation impact study for that, and one of the things that it helped that group to understand was they had achieved this change at a national level in terms of a gender-based violence program, but the next step in order to realize that change was that they had to start to look at the national municipal budgeting, because the change without some kind of explicit programming that was going to be done in order to make that real would not result in any meaningful shifts for the communities they were working with. And so they were able to take that information and then make the changes necessary, as well as to start to realize that though they've been focused on prevention, and Laura told me this is, but they'd been focused on prevention up until that point, that they really had to start to think about also how they're going to address situations where violence was already happening and that those women needed to be helped and potentially put into more safe situations. And when they realized that, rather than saying, and now we need to start a new organization that's going to do that, they essentially said, we need to think about how to hook into organizations and services that are already happening and bring them into our coalition. So it's constantly thinking about, we're a group of independent actors, and who else needs to be in here for us to tackle this system.
So, actually, before, and I have a question for you, so I'm going to direct it to you, but before I go there, as I'm hearing the two of you talk, I'm thinking, I spent many years with a service-based organization, one, oh, sorry, can you hear me? I spent many years with an organization called Catholic Relief Services. Now this is a service organization. They do have a rights component. And one thing I found very, very difficult was this organization trying to manage both approaches. That somehow a rights-based approach, the locus of sustainability is in the change in the system and the people that are able to claim their power. Sustainability in a service approach looks very different. Will that service continue? I'm wondering from our two Oxfam representatives again, have you seen where both those approaches work, or is there an internal tension?
I think there is somewhat of a tension, but it's also more and more we're thinking about, well, first of all, more and more we're moving away from doing strict service provision. So it's really becoming the exception rather than the rule. And the place where you see it the most is still in our humanitarian work rather than in our development work. That's not true across the Oxfam system, but for Oxfam America in particular, because we're not as big as some of the other Oxfams, essentially at some point you say, for the amount of money we have, doesn't even make sense to do this. But I would say that some places where what we're doing is more service provision, we're thinking about it more as testing something as a pilot that we might want to have someone else pick up. So we test out X technology, or does SRI work in this context? Sorry, that's a rice production method. And then we say, if it is working, then how do you help that community then advocate for? We want more of this from our government, and we want more of this from the major donors. So you're not, it's thinking about how do you bump it up to another level.
There are tensions, particularly in countries with more closed political spaces. So when Oxfam was moved, the whole system, the Oxfam international system, was moving to more rights-based approach, there were flare-up points. So, for example, in Zimbabwe, where one affiliate was doing a lot of service delivery, and Oxfam America, as it happened, was doing more advocacy work, there was a real concern by the implementing affiliate that they would be asked to leave the country because Oxfam was doing what was regarded as controversial work. So there are obviously tensions there. And also, doing rights-based development, you don't get to point to the houses and the tin roofs or the school necessarily. The time frames are longer. Again, it's not linear and so forth. So there are some tensions around that, often actually internally with, for example, the fundraising department and the program department. But I do think that over the last decade, the Oxfam system as a whole has really embraced this and accepts the risk and accepts the ambiguities. But it's certainly, you do see, you saw it in CARE when they were trying to move to a rights-based approach. And yeah, it's something I think organizations have to work their way through.
And it could take decades, literally. I happen to have a bias towards the rights-based approach. But I want to move on and...
Can I actually follow up?
Yeah, I was going to ask you something, because it seems like the delivery of aid and the numbers you're looking at, it's agnostic in terms of its approaches. You're just looking at it in general. But do you want to follow up on that?
Well, I was actually wondering to what extent being rights-based, because I'm learning a whole lot right here myself, I'm taking notes. To what extent the rights-based nature versus service-oriented nature really affects the ability of the NGO to find an institutional entry point with the legislative, with Congress, with members of Congress who need to champion your proposal, because they're in essence earmarking everything. So
I have to punt on that a little bit because Oxfam doesn't take government money,
Oh.
so they haven't really had to struggle with that, and I honestly don't know how other agencies manage that.
And I would say it very much differs from donor to donor what the outcomes they're looking for, and there are donors who are more interested in the rights-based approach, and there are others who want more service delivery, and actually it depends from area to area that they're funding what they're looking for, but you do see that there are some donors that are explicitly looking at how do you create shifts in power, and then how do you do that legitimately also as a donor. I think it's a big question.
So I'm going to actually move on to the next programmed question. bring out some more ideas, and then we might see if we can engage some of you. Here's the question, I'm directed to you, Simone. Do you agree that the problems that make aid so ineffective, so we have to buy into, somebody's calling aid ineffective, that might be news for some of you. Maybe you think it's working really well out there. Do you agree that the problems that make aid so ineffective are often internal to the delivery system, i.e. the types of accountability that prevail and don't prevail, the time horizons, the learning, the framing, the routines, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, but it also sort of, for me, analytically, it requires to break down. There are different layers at which the aid delivery system really works. So one that's often overlooked is that the extent to which donors respond or respond not to what happens in the recipient government or a potential recipient is very conditioned by institutional factors in the donor countries, or the strength of the development lobby in the donor countries. If you think, for instance, of Japan as a donor, Japan has been criticized very heavily on providing primarily government-to-government aid, regardless. But that should not be surprising in light of the fact that the NGO community in Japan is just very weak, and so it's a very state-centric mode of development. But that is a function of the domestic factors in the donor countries. So rather than what often happens is expecting donors to move in the same direction, and then exploring and thinking, and then wondering whether differences account for altruism versus selfishness or other non-developmental goals. It's important to think about that part of the delivery story that really takes place before the aid even gets allocated, right? So is there an opportunity to channel my aid through NGOs? Or is there not? That's going to determine the extent to which I use NGOs as delivery channels. And then the second issue is that the aid delivery system, so there is a macro level where decision makers talk about totals, right? So they talk about commitments and totals, and then there is a project level, which is much more aid agency driven, from what I understand, where managerial interests come into play, and inertia and aid agencies might contribute to aid effectiveness. But so my focus is sort of at that level of the decision making that's just above the project level. And here the question is, to what extent are donors really conditioning the aid effectively on what happens in the recipient country, right? And if they do so, if they're really trying to avoid corruption, then are they using the right mechanisms to do so? And there is quite a bit of variation across donors and the extent to which they do that.
So, as I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking we have an interesting terminology, aid delivery system. And yet we have two people here that represent a rights-based approach. So, I'm thinking, how does one deliver a right? So our whole system seems to be geared around the delivery of products and services. Rights-based approach maybe is challenging that a little bit and saying, no, it's anthropologists would say it's emic, it's going to bubble up from within. And we're going to pull it out of people, and there's the sustainability. So I guess I would like to ask you, Laura, the same question, and I'll repeat it for the audience. Do you agree that the problems that make aid so ineffective are often internal to the delivery system, i.e. the types of accountability that prevail, don't prevail, time horizons, etc.?
Yes, I would like to just challenge the premise a bit, and many times aid is effective, and I think we should acknowledge that so we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. When I teach monitoring and evaluation, which I do at Brandeis, I tell the students that there are three types of problems. There are implementation problems, there are strategy problems, and there are theory of change problems. and this question's around sort of the implementation level. Implementation is really important because if you don't implement well, if you don't do what you said you would do and do it well, you can't really test whether the strategy is any good or much less the theory of change. And there's plenty of evidence that there are all kinds of operational issues with development projects that stumble. Some can be kind of technical, problematic. Some can be the incentives that have been built in. One thing that I never understood is why USAID, well, I do understand why they went to more private contracting. I understand that piece, but I don't understand why they did cost-plus contracts. So that basically built in incentives to spend a lot of money, which is paid back, and then you get a margin in terms of profit. So those operational things are really important. On the strategy and theory of change level, I'm going to repeat a bit of what I said earlier, but to me, development's a political problem. It's not a technical problem. And unless you take kind of a political economy approach to development and development interventions, you're very likely to get it wrong. And so I see that as being the more fundamental problem than kind of operational structures and systems type thing.
So now that's interesting. If you want to build infrastructure across a certain country, say in sub-Saharan Africa, you're saying the issue is, the development issue is not a technical problem, that all the technical resources that are needed reside there. What's needed is the incentives and the information. I'm missing the technical piece.
Okay.
Where does
well,
that
I mean, there are technical aspects to development interventions. Road building or delivering a health systems and so forth. But if you go and you get private contractors and you build the road without doing basically your due diligence, making sure, figuring out who controls the concrete business in the country, who's the brother of the president, and figure out all those things, you may make a lot of mistakes. You may build the road and, within 2 years it's fallen to pieces, which is what often happens. So it's really becoming very engaged in the system that you're intervening in to really figure out how it works.
And that seems to me that we're talking about patience here. Patience to understand a system. I know Ashley keeps saying a systems approach, a systems approach. When we're talking about systems, we're talking about dynamic systems where different forces play upon each other. To me, it would take a long time to figure a system out to be able to act appropriately in it. What does this do to development timeframes? And then I would like to hear, based on what they say, a response from you, knowing how aid is allocated. Is a systems approach possible in 2 or 3 years, which is the planning horizon for most projects?
So, I think it was about 5 years ago, maybe longer now, at Oxfam, we moved for our programs, thinking in a 10 to 15-year time horizon. So we're really talking about change that's happening over a much longer period than a project. It doesn't mean you don't do projects, you do projects, but you do it within this larger frame, this longer term frame, where you have a better sense of how you think things are going to shift, and then you're adjusting as you go along. And I would say where we see the most success in our programs is where we've been working in that area for a while, and so we do know the system pretty well. So for example, we have an extractive industries program that has been going along for quite a long time now, and they are really good at understanding how does extractive industries work in specific contexts. They understand it at a global level, they more and more understand it at a country level and at a community level, and that's what it takes. It takes really you and your partners and your allies starting to get on the same page about what are those levers, because we don't have a lot of money, and the amount of money that we have is going to be significantly less, especially if you're talking about something like oil, gas, and mining companies, than the resources they have available. So what are those little places where we can, and we push that button, we think this, and this will happen. And then let's test, did that, and that happen? Or, A and B happened, and then this crazy other thing happened that we weren't expecting it. What does that tell us about our theory of change? So it really is, when we talk about systems, it's trying to map out, I always think of it as, if you all have been to Logan Airport, there are those complex. There's these balls that go around, they make noise, they do all, you basically are getting to that point of saying, you know, if we put this ball here, we think it'll go down this path, and then it'll lead to that, and it'll knock over this, and it'll do this, and this, which is when the theory of change becomes so important, because mapping that out, making it explicit, and saying, if this doesn't happen, then we need to go back and revisit our strategy. We need to go back and revisit our assumptions about how change is going to happen in this context. So you're not just plowing forward for 15 years and never picking your head up and saying, you know, were we right to begin with?
I'd love to hear from you, because aid is traditionally allocated. We're talking about government-to-government aid or bilateral aid. It's usually allocated along a project theme. Sometimes government-to-government, it's budgetary. But what does this mean? And we're talking about a patient approach, understanding maybe discrete steps that could be projectized, but we're talking about big horizons when we're talking about a rights-based approach. If donor aid is going to start looking at rights-based approaches seriously, what can we expect from your perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that come to mind here is that when you just look at the aid that donors typically allocate to NGOs in the developing country, what you quickly learn is that most of the NGO aid actually goes through international NGOs versus local NGOs, right? And so it's sort of, I'm picking up on this because, you know, learning about the developing country, learning about systems, and trying to bring about change, of course, also involves getting the local actors involved in the process, right? And so what happens often in an example would be Germany as a donor. They talk very much about sustainability, but what happens is that most of the aid is given through the German NGOs, which then go to the developing country, and just to play the devil's advocate, the local NGOs are trying to please the German NGOs, right? So they're trying to appear as Western as possible. They know they need to do a PowerPoint, they know they need to speak English, they know they need to have some sort of auditing requirement, they know they need to do a final report. And these are the four main criteria that qualify you as a sort of as an end user NGO. And here, of course, then the question is to what extent are donors then tapping into truly local capacity, or something that's local and that can be built from a systems perspective, rather than trying to westernize a civil society that just has very, very, very different roots. And so one of the things that one observes if one compares across the full range of donor countries is that countries like the Scandinavian countries seem to be much more in tune with the local sector. And please tell me if I'm wrong, and if you observe differences, that are actually engaging the local society much more, and they seem to be more risk acceptant in the sense that they're willing to, or they're less pursuing the stovepipe approach, where the INGO functions as an additional layer of accountability, but where there is supposed to be the triangular cooperation where the NGO, you know, sort of functions as a consultant, but where the real the focus is on building capacity among local NGOs. And I think that is something, and Ashley and I talked about this briefly before, that the USAID is now actively embracing with their Forward initiative. You know, it's a very new concept, so who knows whether, you know, that'll actually take hold. But there is some appreciation of the fact that maybe the past years of sort of funding or trying to push the NGO sector in the recipient countries has not been as successful. And I think that's where the right-based NGOs are so important, right? Because the service delivery NGOs have their incentives, and they're very, as you mentioned before, they're not for profit, but they need to survive. And so I think the rights-based NGOs are probably the ones that can really push for that shift to occur, and a more local orientation of, for
So could you just describe the Forward Initiative and why that's different?
So all that I sort of take away from that, and you probably you don't know. Okay, so a little bit more.
Actually, I'm gonna know more than you.
Okay, so it's basically the idea is to move away from big contracting firms like just let's use another example. So the Kerry Lugar bill, which you might be familiar with, has establishes an extremely high burn rate in Pakistan on an annual basis, which is around $4 million per week. That means donors, and I'm using this as an extreme example to just illustrate some of the tensions. And so the problem is, of course, that USAID is now trying to find someone who can implement the project. And so what more often than not happens is that a large contractor, which is very expensive, gets the bulk of money, right? You're not going to find many NGOs in Pakistan who speak, who have somebody who speaks English and who fulfill these very minimal criteria of development. And so yes, this is an extreme case, but so USAID seems to be, at least on paper, be concerned with doing more like smaller contracts rather than giving millions to one contractor, and then also giving more money to local actors as opposed to the international private sector or even US-based NGOs. And so there's more to the initiative, and it's probably interesting to check it out because critics have been very positive about that initiative, and at least on paper, but that's sort of how I understand it.
So thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I'll only to point out that there's a whole rethinking of development aid that's going on. It's happening inside the U.S. government, which usually is on the lagging edge of aid, because I think of DFID and the Germans as much more forward-thinking. If it's happening inside the U.S. government, it's happening. And it's very exciting, actually. I have some former students that are working on this project, and it's a whole different energy than just a few years ago. Because people are saying, okay, there's parts of the system that aren't working. Now, we can't ignore it any longer. Let's really think about what it's going to take. They may get it wrong next year, they may get it wrong the year after, but they're looking at many of the same things that Oxfam is looking at, actually. So it's an interesting time. Ashley, did you want to
just to add? I mean, to be clear, we certainly don't feel like we're all the way there within Oxfam either. I mean, there are places where I think we're doing good work, and there are a lot of places where we have a lot of room to improve. And one of the areas that has always been a struggle is what does it mean to do a rights-based approach and be a humanitarian organization, which is incredibly service-oriented. And it has a humanitarian imperative, but in terms of building power, what does that mean? And in fact, we sometimes think of it as it's the big green wave. There's an emergency, and there's this wave of humanitarian actors that come in and try to respond. And one of the things that we're now working on within Oxfam is to say that's not sustainable given the number of emergencies that we're seeing, especially small emergencies. If we sort of think about climate change and what may happen in terms of increased volatility, then how do we have to change what we're doing in order to meet those new demands, and that's more consistent with what we're doing in other areas of our work. And so thinking more and more about building the capacity of local organizations, building the ability of populations to hold their governments accountable for the kind of response that they need, and moving away from a service delivery model, which I think is in line with, that is a very, humanitarian is probably the most traditional in most INGOs, it's the most traditional arm of their repertoire. And so even if the humanitarians are moving more and more to just thinking, well, what if we're not doing it? What if others are coming in and taking care of this? Then you are starting to see a shift that is pretty fundamental.
Great, so I'm going to ask our last question and then turn it over to all of you. The question is, what innovations seem to be making a difference? And who's innovating? Is it headquarters? Is it the field? Is it coming outside, somewhere in between? Laura, I'm going to turn that one over to you.
I'm going to be super brief because actually I'd really like to hear from you all. I would say interesting things that are happening is Brazil is becoming a donor country, doing really interesting work on smallholder agriculture and in health systems. say that BROC, the Bangladeshi organization that now works in various countries in Asia and Africa, it has an enterprise arm that helps it be almost, I think, 60% self-financing. There's a BROC University. The Aga Khan Foundation also is a very interesting model that people should look at. And then this whole thing of Kiva and kind of the peer-to-peer lending model. There are lots of issues with it and problems, but it's really, I'm going to use the word threatening, but really sort of threatening to the big international agencies, because Kiva basically cuts out the middleman. Why should your money go through an Oxfam or Save the Children when it can go much more directly to intermediaries in countries? So I think those are sort of 3 or 4 big changes.
Great. Ashley, do you want to comment? And Simone?
I'd say more along the lines of, in addition to some of the things we talked about before, what are some of the things that I think are really exciting, what I get really excited about, and most of this is within Oxfam, but I get really excited about, as we're trying to think about systems change, there is this idea that different people are touching different parts of the elephant of this system, and so how do you start to connect people who are thinking at a global level about changes in SEC rules and people who are working with mining communities in a very local context? How do you begin to connect them in ways that are very powerful and that ultimately privilege the perspective of community on how this change is impacting them, but is also not saying communities have all the answers, which I think in the past has been a little bit of a twee. I don't know what the other word for twee is, but so that's really exciting to me. And the idea of, as a former campaigner, of what we think of as, yes, you create this change at a national or global level, but it doesn't matter until it results in change at the community level. And so how are you walking that, continuing, some people say the last mile, I think of it as it's the 25.2 miles after you get that initial policy win of making sure that it's in the budget, and then if it's in the budget, people know that it's in the budget, and they're able to hold people accountable and marching that all the way down until it means that people's lives have really changed. And then I would say it's not an innovation as much as it is an important practice that I see inside of Oxfam, which is it matters where your money comes from, and there's a lot of discipline, I think, within organizations that's required to be able to say, what kind of money do we need to do this kind of a program, and let's try not to take the money that's going to pull us off target. And I think it's actually a very difficult thing to do, but as someone inside Oxfam says, good money is the money that helps you do the thing that you want to do, bad money is the thing that pulls you away from that pulls away management attention. It's not just the money, it's people have to think about that program, they have to think about how to market that program, and all of a sudden you start to feel get off kilter. So, thinking about interesting mixes in restricted and unrestricted money from a very pragmatic standpoint, it can make a big difference in terms of what you're able to accomplish. And it may mean staying a little bit smaller, but it may also mean that you can be more flexible and do more interesting things.
It's really interesting. Simone, where are the innovations coming from?
Yeah, let me just talk about 2. One would be, and they're really empirically, these are real sort of innovative ideas, but there has to be still some evidence accumulated to see whether they work. But the Center for Global Development has come up with this cash on delivery idea about making the delivery of aid conditional on certain benchmarks that the government is actually achieving, which means that it really forces accountability between the donor and the government. That is from a top-down accountability point of view. So I think that actually makes a lot of sense. There has been the bottom-up accountability trend, which is in the poverty reduction papers by the World Bank, where they try and get locals involved in the monitoring by basically having them be part of the sort of the setup of the project, and the more stake you have, the idea goes, the more likely you are to actually hold your village needs or implementing agents accountable. But that's had problems. But I think in theory the idea is very good, because if you don't allow if governments are not checked by their own people, then what are the chances that down the road there is going to be some sustainability? And then in line with that, it's actually a Japanese initiative, and it's interesting that it comes from Japan. I think some other donors have it on a very small scale, but they're actually having a lot of, last year or the year before, made a lot of very fungible money, not a pot with big money that's moved to the embassies in the recipient country, and their NGOs, local NGOs only can apply, and then the embassy staff is actually giving grants out for particular projects. And so the idea is, again, if we don't have our own INGOs, we don't necessarily want to give it to other NGOs, and so let's try and really go directly to the local NGO population. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like this idea of country ownership, it's important to engage the recipient government, but I think it's equally important to get the civil society to participate and just demand accountability.
So it sounds like there's innovations happening all the way up and down the line. And this is important because aid was not always like this. You are coming into it in a really exciting time. Aid was hampered for years by different kinds of best practices. You weren't really allowed to innovate. The sector I come from is financial services. And financial services mainstream, and then financial services and aid. And you were discouraged from innovating. There was one way to do something and you had to do it. Now we're hearing there's many, many exciting things. You're studying them here, right at Harvard or in the Boston area. Social impact bonds. We don't know if they really work. There's one or two examples, but it's a new way of funding things. It's a new lens we're looking through. So I would say I envy all of you that you're coming into this world in what I think is a thrilling time to be part of this sector. So I'd like to close with that and ask all of you to think about questions that you might like to ask our panelists. Yes, in the front here. Yeah.
So I'm Adam Otenko. I'm a career advisor at the Helen School of Brandeis. I work closely with the students that Dr. Roper teaches. My question is about the for-profit and corporate models of organizations and the development work that they do. And it specifically comes from the experience of watching a meeting between my students who are largely international students from developing countries who are very service and rights focused, and a meeting they had with a for-profit development organization in DC who basically consists of MBA graduates who then go on to work at McKinsey and other corporate consulting companies, and that's the model that they use of doing implementation work. And there was a real disconnect between them, just in terms of communication and the language that they use and understanding, because this organization, I would say, was less rights or service focused and more focused on their client, the donor, and what their interests were. That's basically it. So what is the impact of corporate and for-profit systems on development as it relates to specifically self-interest and motivation, but also possibly innovations and aid effectiveness?
Who would like to take that?
Maybe we can collect a few so we can...
Yes, why don't we collect a few and then we'll ignore that one.
I can speak pretty loudly. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on management or organizational culture. You talked about, what you need for impact is a good theory of change, a good strategy, good implementation. So what are some NGO management practices or organizational culture that promotes effectiveness? Because we're all planning on entering this field, and then maybe comment on organizations that you think are doing a good job of that.
Well, Oscar, of course.
And I'd love to hear from you as well.
Any other? Yeah.
My question is about a specific organization. You mentioned country ownership, and you mentioned that the U.S. government is finally getting to the point where it's ready to innovate and think of aid differently. What do you think of the Millennium Challenge Corporation and more recent initiative, and whether or not, or how it fits with your first question, the myopic self-interest?
skip one because I don't know how to. I think it's just that's a long road to go down, and so I'm gonna skip the first one. Just on the management and organizational effectiveness. I think that's something that I spend a lot of time working on, and I think it's not a simple answer, but part of it is around what does it mean to be a learning organization, and how do you, and I think that what Laura was talking about, how do you take information as you're getting it, which isn't all going to be about success. I mean, it's critical to understand that mail systems aren't about showing that you're doing the right thing. It's often about showing you that you're doing the wrong thing, and then what do you do about that? And being willing to persist with programs that you might need to be shifting, and then also being able to make the call sometimes that you're just not having the impact that you wanted. And then I also think there's a very simple, many of us who start in development, we don't come from a management background, and we start off as program officers or policy advisors, and we make our way, up the ranks, and we become managers, and we don't actually know what that means to be a manager. How do you manage resources? How do you manage people? And more organizations are thinking about, you have to have excellent managers. They enable everyone else to do their jobs well, but what does that mean in a nonprofit environment and not in a for-profit environment? I mean, how do you keep people connected to the mission? How do you help manage very scant resources and people who could potentially be making a lot more money somewhere else, being motivated to move ahead, and where do you find excellence in managers and have that be a skill that's celebrated along with being able to lobby on Capitol Hill or whatever it happens to be. So I think that there are some good practices that are emerging, and we get really excited when we start to see managers that are able to have their people flourish. But I think it is around, part of what that is the ability to embrace failure and learn from it, and the ability to hold you and your colleagues accountable for delivery. So we don't often talk about, it's very uncomfortable to hold your colleagues accountable. I think even more uncomfortable sometimes in mission organizations where everybody feels like they're doing the best that they can. But we have to be accountable to something else, which is the impact that we're seeking. And so getting really good at that sometimes just takes practice.
Well, I'm going to try the first question, but only in the sense that I don't think there is a real answer to it. I think what you're raising is a very, very important issue, and that is that not only for profits, but also not-for-profit organizations spend a lot of time appealing to donors. And the rights-based NGO like Oxfam does not need to do that, right? Because they're primarily funded through other sources. And so I think this implies that a lot of the operational costs of any of these service delivery NGOs goes directly into that self-promotion, pleasing the donors part of the budget. Now that is not going directly to development, so it's hard. But the question is, so we understand that there is a problem, but so the question is, how do you work around it? Because there has to be that in there, right? So donors they want the NGO or the for-profit contracting company to report. They have monitoring and evaluation. So I wonder if just simply the nature of the relationship in that, the fact that a donor gives millions of dollars to a certain NGO is just that's implied. So whether that's good for development is another question, but it's almost a necessary evil in the sense that maybe if extremely altruistic, the donor could say, no, I don't want you to spend all that time on accounting for my money, but then, who's being held accountable then, right? And so you don't want to be the aid agency that doesn't have the records straight. And so I think there's this tension, inherent tension in the process. And then let me just quickly talk about the MCC initiative. So I really like the initiative in the sense that it's an institutionalization of selectivity, right? So you have objective, you're supposedly objective criteria, right? And so those can be meddled with. But at least there's this acknowledgement that yes, so in terms of a signaling institution, if you don't, to the recipient country, if your corruption score exceeds a certain amount, we're no longer going to fund you through the government-to-government channel, right? So that's the premise of MCC. But what that, of course, means is that the countries that need the aid most are going to get little, if any. So you're going to have the Sudans, you're going to have the fragile African countries that don't even come near to qualifying for the threshold program, much less the compact program. And so the MCC, I think, makes a lot of sense in addition to other funding logics, but that by itself cannot be sort of the right model for channeling aid, because it just means that you're dealing with the Tanzanias of the world, which clearly have it more together than other countries.
So I think we've touched on a lot of questions. As I'm listening to our respondents, our panelists talking, I'm thinking, you know, we still haven't gotten at that sticky, that gnarly question, which is really what is development? We have development aid, we have rights-based development, but what is development? Currently, the theory of change looks at outcomes, right? So you have a theory, and then you bring it to a result. And it follows a step, a chain step of firings, you know, the synapses fire, and then you finally get to the end, and you have a happy person. That's what we're all looking for. But the problem is, of course, we're defining that. And we can never really move away. When you're involved in development aid, humanitarian aid, you basically are making judgments. And it's all about judging. We're trying to become better judges. But so why I'm an advocate for the rights-based process is it is truly a process. So you may have a goal of women's empowerment, but the real process is claiming the right. And it might get uncomfortable. There might be innovations that are happening out there that you don't feel so good about. I'll give you a quick example. I was working with a savings program in Nicaragua, and very innocent sounding, right? Lots of women's savings groups, and they were plastering the countryside with all these groups. And I went down to take a look last year, and had been functioning for 2 years. And lo and behold, a lot of these groups have kids in them, and the kids have spun off into their own children's groups, 9 to 13, 14 years old. Oh, it sounds fantastic, right? So the kids are saving. That's good news. The kids are saving, and they're also lending. They're lending at extortionary rates to older people in the village. And this is becoming very widespread. Meantime, another group of people has gotten together, and their biggest money-making is holding country dances and selling beer on credit. But the reality is, we had said this is a process. We don't care about the outcome. We think this process of this kind of financial service is beneficial. We have to take what we can get. And so what we saw was something maybe we were very uncomfortable with. However, I think the net result is some catalytic process had been unleashed and something was happening. So again, if you want to be, and I'm assuming if you're in this audience, you probably want to participate in some kind of aid somehow. You have to be willing to really let go and see the process as the real outcome. So I urge you to approach our panelists after. I'm going to close here and now. Thank you.